Last night, but it bears repeating, and it'll help keep people energized. I'd like to start by just thanking everyone again, asking everyone again for a big round of applause for Hampshire SJP and everyone else who helped with the This is a truly historic event, and I'm very proud to be a part of it. That said, as is the case with Fayyad and with Nora, who spoke last night, this is actually not my first National Campus BDS conference. But it's my first in nearly 4 years, and it's also my first since the 2005 Palestinian Civil Society BDS call has fundamentally reshaped the contours of global Palestine solidarity activism. Well, the call was actually issued a few months before the last national conference, which was held in February of 2006. But its full impact was not felt right away. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that even now, we're only getting a taste of what its full impact is going to be. So, for those of you who aren't aware, these previous national BDS conferences, National Campus BDS conferences, were organized by a coalition called the Palestine Solidarity Movement, or the PSM. The first one was held at Berkeley in February 2002, as Nora mentioned, and further conferences were held at a number of other universities through 2006, generally drawing between 300 and 800 people. PSM was comprised overwhelmingly and at first exclusively of campus-based organizations. I'm not going to go into a detailed analysis of the PSM right now, but I'd like to highlight what I consider to be the key distinction between that phase of the campus movement and the one we're in now. Simply put, we were ahead of the curve. We focused our attention on divestment, and we were doing so beginning nearly 4 years before the formal BDS call from Palestinian Civil Society. One of the major challenges that this presented to us was that the campus movement needed to develop its own set of principles and demands. PSM conferences tended to include hours upon hours upon hours of meetings spent formulating, revising, and revising again our political platform. Individual organizations within the PSM were free to maintain their own platforms, but the coalition demanded agreement with a certain set of core principles as a prerequisite for participation. We also maintained a more detailed set of principles which were ostensibly the broad platform of us all, but in practice were actually bitterly contested amongst the constituent groups. Dealing with these issues occupied a huge portion of our time, leaving us far less time to deal with issues like internal education, resource development, or the establishment of any effective system for keeping member organizations in touch with one another between the annual conferences, save for discussions about organizing those conferences. Now, the issuance and broad acceptance of the Palestinian BDS call has increased the potential of our movement on an exponential scale. We don't need to waste valuable time.
Beautiful.
We don't need to waste valuable time bickering over minutia. We don't need to try to decide for ourselves what Palestinians want. And we don't need to ignore the vital tasks of our movement for the sake of maintaining some sort of ideological homogeneity. A diversity of beliefs and approaches is a strength of our movement, not a weakness. And Palestinians have given us an incredible tool for maintaining that strength within a framework that they have defined for themselves. There's no such thing as solidarity without accountability. And one of the ways in which we must maintain that accountability is by making the Palestinian BDS call the centerpiece of our movement. Another important component of solidarity is actually communicating with the people with whom we intend to be in solidarity. Palestinian organizations have enough to deal with without having to shoulder nearly the entire burden of reaching out to solidarity groups around the world. Our organizations need to reach out to them, and those lines of communication need to be maintained. Palestinians are not the only people with whom we need to be communicating and coordinating. At PSM conferences, attendees always told us that the most valuable aspect of the experience, along with the skill building workshops, was simply the opportunity to connect with fellow organizers, to share experiences and ideas, and be reminded that no matter what kinds of unique challenges they faced, whether they were based in rural Iowa or Midtown Manhattan, and no matter how they chose to tailor their campaigns to the specific social and political landscape of their campus, we were all a part of something much larger than ourselves, and together we would achieve the impossible. Developing effective mechanisms for maintaining that sort of communication is the most important task facing our movement. The greatest threat to our achievement of this goal is for us to become sidetracked by attempts to develop some sort of formal bureaucratic structure at this time. PSM was a coalition and a movement which desperately needed a network. Today, that pivotal need remains. Such bodies, with their delegates and voting and resolutions, could eventually be a useful tool for organizing our movement. This would require a meticulously crafted structure designed to prevent any unscrupulous group from undermining the democratic character of the body, while simultaneously ensuring that its structure and processes don't become an impediment to the participation of activists with limited time for dealing with bureaucracy. To attempt to develop such a thing now, when our core task is simply to develop channels for effective communication, would be premature, counterproductive, and threaten to undermine all attempts to address the movement's more immediate needs. The fate of the PSM stands as a testament to this basic fact. So what are the other major tasks facing our movement? This is something I've spent a good deal of time thinking about. One of the greatest things about PSM was that we came up with a lot of very good ideas. It's true. We wanted to create mechanisms not only for communication, but for resource sharing on a large scale. We wanted to offer our members access to training and mentoring. We wanted to identify what worked and what didn't, and make this knowledge available to all of our members. Perhaps most of all, we wanted to take decisive action to prevent this constant reinventing of the wheel, which even then we saw taking place on campuses all around the country and indeed around the world. We had many great ideas, but we were prevented from actualizing any of them because we were too busy dealing with bureaucracy. In an attempt to finally bring some of these ideas to fruition, the Palestine Freedom Project was formed just as PSM was organizing what was to be its final conference. Our first task was simply identifying our constituents. So we spent months creating a database of all the Palestine solidarity organizations we could identify around the world. We then developed an extensive survey designed to identify needs and trends and to help define our own priorities for resource and program development. We ended up receiving nearly 200 responses from organizations in almost 20 countries. We spent our time since then responding to those needs by creating the precise things that people said were needed: a speakers bureau, a directory of organizations, an online collaboratively developed handbook of best practices information, a database of online resources, and a set of training workshops, which we could deliver both at conferences like this one and locally to anyone who needed them. None of this would be possible without the tireless efforts of our interns and volunteers. And if you happen to find me in a moment later in the conference, I'd like to tell you about our new internship program we're offering, in which participants not only earn academic credit and not only work from wherever they like, but actually spend up to 50% of their hours working on their own local campaigns. So as you can see, I think that one of the most important tasks that we face is simply learning from one another, sharing our resources, sharing our insights, leveraging all relevant knowledge and experiences from both within the movement and from elsewhere. Now, one of the most important elsewheres that I think we need to look is actually the private sector. There's an admission. I grew up as the son of a marketing consultant. And despite the fact that he was partly responsible for Crystal Pepsi, insofar as he was unable to convince his client that this was a supremely horrific idea, my father actually taught me a lot about the need to base any form of systematic, broad-based communication designed to influence a decision, which is what marketers do, and is also one of the many things that activists do. To base this on a detailed understanding